The door to Gregory Thorne's spy shop burst open with such force that a rack of cinnamon sticks toppled to the floor. Gregory barely looked up from his counter, casually stirring a cup of tea as if he hadn't just witnessed his front door nearly explode off its hinges. 3 men in tattered leather armor stormed in, their faces twisted with the kind of arrogance that only comes from a life spent intimidating those weaker than themselves. "Evening, gentlemen," Gregory said lazily, taking a sip of his tea. "Might I interest you in some fine saffron? Fresh shipment just arrived." The largest of the 3, a bald brute with a scar that cut across his jaw, stepped forward and slammed his fist on the counter, rattling jars and sending dried herbs skittering across the surface. "You owe us," the brute growled. "Time to pay." Gregory let out a soft chuckle, the kind that somehow managed to sound both amused and deeply unimpressed. "I'm afraid my accountant's out right now. Perhaps you could leave an invoice?" "Funny man," the brute sneered, drawing a knife from his belt. "You won't be laughing when we're done with you." Gregory sighed, set down his tea, and slowly rose from his chair. "Look," he said, voice calm but firm. "I'm just a simple merchant. I don't want trouble. But if you force my hand—" He paused, his eyes narrowing. "I promise you'll regret it." The brute smirked and lunged forward. It happened in an instant. Gregory's hand shot out like a whip, seizing the thug's wrist. Before the man could react, Gregory twisted it sharply, forcing the blade from his fingers. In the same motion, Gregory grabbed a wooden pestle from the counter and drove it into the man's ribs. The brute stumbled back, wheezing in pain. The second thug charged, but Gregory sidestepped him with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural for a merchant. In a blur of motion, Gregory grabbed a jar of chili powder and hurled it into the man's face. The thug howled, clutching his burning eyes. The third man, now frozen in uncertainty, fumbled to draw his sword. "I wouldn't," Gregory warned. His voice had changed now, colder, sharper, like steel drawn across stone. The third man bolted for the door instead, dragging his coughing companion with him. The bald brute groaned on the floor, still clutching his ribs. Gregory knelt beside him. "Tell your boss," he said quietly, "that I've paid him enough." His hand lingered on the man's shoulder for a moment, then he gave a reassuring pat that felt strangely unsettling. "Go on now," he added, "before I change my mind." The thug staggered to his feet and stumbled out the door, vanishing into the night. Gregory stood alone in his spy's shop, staring down at the mess, spilled herbs, shattered jars, and his now cold cup of tea. He sighed deeply, rubbing his face. This was the 3rd time in a month the Iron Fangs had sent men to shake him down. He knew they wouldn't stop. Sooner or later they'd push him too far. He walked to a small shelf in the corner of the room and reached behind a row of spice jars. His fingers found the familiar grip of a curved dagger, its handle worn, its blade still deadly sharp. Gregory stared at it for a long time, memories swirling like a storm behind his eyes. Years ago, this blade had been his closest friend, a tool that had carved a bloody path across countless battlefields. Back then, people had called him by another name. The Crimson Ghost. A legend. A myth. A shadow that had struck fear into the hearts of soldiers and kings alike. He'd buried that past long ago, along with the man he used to be. But some things, it seemed, refused to stay buried. The next morning, Gregory tried to return to normalcy. He swept up the broken glass, restocked the shelves, and greeted his customers with his usual blend of dry humor and awkward charm. But there was a tension in his smile now, a stiffness in his shoulders. The townsfolk didn't seem to notice. They never did. That afternoon, his old friend Marcus stopped by. Marcus had known Gregory before he became a merchant, back when the Crimson Ghost was a name that made warlords flinch. He'd always kept Gregory's past a secret. "You okay?" Marcus asked after noticing the fresh bruise on Gregory's arm. "Fine," Gregory muttered. "Just some idiots trying to collect what they aren't owed." "You know it's not gonna stop," Marcus said. "The Iron Fangs, they don't quit." "I know," Gregory said grimly. "They're coming back," Marcus warned. "And next time, They won't just be here for gold. Gregory gave a tight smile. Then I suppose I'll have to disappoint them. That night, Gregory sat in his kitchen, sharpening his old dagger by candlelight. The blade gleamed wickedly in the dim glow. He hated this feeling, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a stone. He wasn't that man anymore. He was a merchant now, just a quiet man selling spices. But the world, it seemed, wasn't finished with the Crimson Ghost just yet. The next day, the Iron Fangs returned, this time with their leader, Vexen Grudge, in tow. Vexen was a towering man clad in heavy leather armor, a jagged scar running from his forehead to his cheek. He walked with the smug confidence of someone who had never lost a fight, and didn't expect to start now. I'm told you're giving my men a hard time. Vexen sneered as he entered Gregory's shop. I've given your men nothing they didn't deserve. Gregory replied evenly. Vexen chuckled darkly. You're funny. Shame I'm going to have to smash that face of yours in. Don't, Gregory warned, stepping back. You've had your chance to leave me alone. Or what? Vexen grinned. You'll throw some cinnamon sticks at me? Gregory's hand clenched tightly around the dagger hidden beneath his apron. For a moment, he considered drawing it, ending this right here and now. But no. Not yet. He wasn't that man anymore. Instead, Gregory smiled and said, I wouldn't waste my best cinnamon on you. The fight started fast. Shelves were overturned, jars shattered, and Gregory's counter was reduced to splinters. Vexen's men swarmed him, but Gregory moved like smoke. He twisted, dodged, and struck with precision that defied belief. A thrown jar of pepper blinded one attacker, while a swift elbow strike sent another crashing into the wall. But then Vexen grabbed him, a massive hand closing around Gregory's throat. For a moment, Gregory saw nothing but darkness. The world blurred, and cold fingers crept along the edges of his mind, a familiar sensation he had spent years trying to forget. The Crimson Ghost rising from within. With a sudden burst of strength, Gregory broke free, driving his knee into Vexen's ribs. The mercenary staggered back, coughing blood. This isn't over. Vexen snarled, backing toward the door. I know, Gregory said quietly, his gaze sharp as a blade. Vexen spat blood on the floor. You're just a merchant, he sneered. Gregory stared at him, his voice low and dangerous. You should have figured out by now, he said, that I'm not just anything. As the Iron Fangs fled into the night, Gregory stood in the wreckage of his shop, breathing heavily. He knew what was coming next. His quiet life was over. The Crimson Ghost was awake again. Gregory Thorne sat at the back of a dimly lit tavern, his fingers curled tightly around a mug of ale that he had barely touched. The warmth of the fire crackled nearby, yet Gregory felt cold. His mind wasn't in the tavern, it was back in his spice shop, remembering the look on Vexen Grudge's face as he spat blood on Gregory's floor. That look wasn't one of defeat, it was a promise. Vexen wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The tavern door swung open, and Gregory's old friend Marcus stepped inside. He spotted Gregory immediately and approached the table with a grim expression. Without a word, Marcus dropped into the seat across from him. They're planning something, Marcus said after a tense silence. I heard Vexen talking in the square. He's furious, wants to make an example out of you. Gregory exhaled heavily, as if trying to push the weight of the situation out of his chest. I figured as much. Marcus leaned forward, voice dropping low. He's not just angry, he's desperate. Word is the Iron Fangs have been losing ground in the south. They've been bleeding gold for months. You embarrassed him, Greg. He's going to come back with everything he's got. Gregory stared down at his mug. His fingers tightened around it until his knuckles turned white. I can't let this happen, he muttered. I didn't build this life just to watch it burn down because of some thug. You're going to have to be smart about this, Marcus warned. This isn't just a couple of street rats this time. Vexen's got a full crew now, 20, maybe 30 men. Armed and ruthless. Gregory nodded slowly. He wasn't worried about their numbers. He knew how to handle numbers. The problem was what would happen afterward. He had tried so hard to leave that life behind, the violence, the fear, the trail of blood that followed him wherever he went. If he started down that path again, he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop. The next evening, Gregory stood in his spy's shop, watching the sunset bleed gold and orange across the sky. The streets of Elderglen were quiet, but he could feel the tension in the air, like the crackle of a storm just before lightning strikes. He knew it was only a matter of time before Vexen made his move. As if on cue, a sharp knock came at the door. Gregory's hand instinctively drifted beneath the counter, where his curved dagger lay hidden. He moved carefully to the door and peered through the narrow gap. A young man stood there, barely more than a boy, with a swollen eye and dried blood on his shirt. "Please," the boy stammered. "I'm supposed to give you this." He shoved a crumpled piece of parchment through the gap and bolted before Gregory could say a word. Gregory unfolded the note and read it carefully. It wasn't a threat, not directly. It was a warning. Vexen was done playing games. At midnight, the Iron Fangs were coming to finish what they'd started. Gregory closed the door and leaned his back against it. He had a choice now, run or fight. Running was the easier option, but deep down, Gregory knew he couldn't keep running forever. If he left Elderglen, Vexen would follow. Worse, Vexen would take out his anger on the townspeople. Gregory couldn't let that happen. He spent the next few hours preparing. He filled several jars with ground pepper, chili powder, and other painful irritants. He rigged tripwires along the narrow alleyways and scattered broken glass in the shadows. He knew these tricks wouldn't win the fight, but they would slow the Iron Fangs down, and that might be enough. Midnight came, and with it, the sound of heavy boots echoing down the cobbled streets. Gregory knelt in the darkness of his shop, listening carefully. He heard voices, low and angry, followed by the metallic clatter of swords being drawn. The Iron Fangs were here. The first man stepped into the alley beside Gregory's shop. A thin wire snapped under his foot, triggering a cascade of pepper powder that burst into his face. The man staggered back, coughing violently, and Gregory smiled grimly. One down. Moments later, a group of 5 thugs moved toward the front door. Gregory let them get halfway inside before hurling a jar of chili powder directly at their feet. The cloud of burning red dust exploded across the room, sending the attackers sprawling back into the street. The air was filled with pained coughing and furious curses. Then Gregory heard the sound he had been dreading, Vexen's voice. "Light it up!" Vexen growled from somewhere in the shadows. Moments later, the unmistakable flicker of fire danced across the walls as torches ignited. Gregory's heart leapt. He had expected a fight, but not arson. His shop, his home, everything he had built, was about to go up in flames. Gregory grabbed his dagger and slipped out the back, moving silently through the darkness. He circled around and spotted Vexen standing near the main road, flanked by half a dozen men. The firelight flickered in Vexen's eyes as he grinned smugly at the burning spice shop. Gregory struck fast. He darted from the shadows and drove his dagger into the thigh of one of Vexen's men. The man screamed and collapsed. Before the others could react, Gregory snatched a torch from one of their hands and hurled it into a nearby cart, igniting the dry hay inside. Flames erupted, bathing the street in chaotic light. The Iron Fangs turned to face him, and Gregory knew there was no turning back now. He moved like a shadow, weaving between blades, striking swiftly and mercilessly. He parried a sword strike and twisted his dagger into another attacker's arm. Another thug lunged, and Gregory sent him sprawling with a brutal kick to the chest. But Vexen wasn't standing still. The towering mercenary charged Gregory with a roar, swinging a massive club. Gregory dodged the first blow, but the second clipped his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. "I told you this wasn't over," Vexen growled, raising his club again. Gregory rolled away just in time, the club smashing into the cobblestones where his head had been moments earlier. Pain lanced through his arm, but Gregory forced himself to his feet. He circled Vexen, watching the mercenary closely. Vexen was strong, but slow. Gregory knew that if he could outlast him, he could win. Vexen lunged again, and this time Gregory struck fast, driving his dagger deep into Vexen's side. The big man staggered, clutching his wound, but he wasn't finished. With a snarl of rage, Vexen swung wildly, and Gregory ducked, slicing across Vexen's arm with a quick slash. Blood splattered across the cobblestones. Vexen stumbled back, breathing heavily. "This isn't over," he spat, retreating with the few remaining iron fangs. Gregory stood in the flickering firelight, breathing hard. His spice shop was gone, reduced to ash and smoke, but the town still stood, and Vexen's men were scattered. Gregory knew this wasn't victory, not yet. But it was enough for now. He stared at the glowing embers of his home, feeling the weight of his old life pressing down on him again. The Crimson Ghost wasn't gone, not entirely, and it seemed the world wasn't going to let him stay buried. The wind howled through the streets of Elderglen as Gregory stood among the smoldering remains of his spice shop. The embers still glowed faintly, crackling like whispers of failure. Smoke stung his eyes, but Gregory barely noticed. He had spent years crafting this quiet life, brick by brick, only to watch it crumble in a single night. He had always believed he could outrun his past, that the Crimson Ghost was just a shadow of the man he used to be. But Vexen had forced his hand. The monster Gregory had buried deep inside had stirred, and now it was awake. Gregory spent most of that night sifting through the wreckage. Broken jars, scorched shelves, blackened walls. There was almost nothing left. The townspeople had tried to help, but Gregory had sent them away. He didn't want their pity. He knew what they were thinking, that he had brought this on himself. Word of his past had begun to spread. The whispers had grown louder. Some were afraid of him, others curious. But one thing was certain: he could no longer pretend to be just a merchant. By dawn, Gregory stood outside his ruined shop, clutching a small wooden box he had pulled from the ashes. Inside lay a crimson hood, a pair of curved daggers, and a leather strap bearing a simple insignia, the mark of the Crimson Ghost. He had once sworn he would never wear them again. But now, as he stared down at those tools of his past, he knew he had no choice. For the next few days, Gregory kept to himself. He spent his time in an old storage shed just outside of town, where he sharpened his blades, tested the weight of his armor, and pushed his body harder than he had in years. His muscles ached, his breathing came heavy, but slowly, something familiar returned, that cold precision, that ruthless instinct. The man who had once terrified entire armies was finding his footing again. Gregory knew that Vexen wasn't finished. The Iron Fangs had been humiliated, but men like Vexen didn't know how to let things go. Gregory couldn't afford to wait for their next move. On the third night, Gregory slipped through the streets of Elderglen under the cover of darkness. He moved like smoke, fast, silent, and unseen. The Iron Fangs had claimed an old mill on the outskirts of town as their hideout, and Gregory knew they'd be celebrating their so-called victory. He had spent the day watching them from a distance, studying their movements, noting the gaps in their patrols. He knew they felt safe now, convinced they had broken him. That arrogance would be their downfall. Gregory crept to the edge of the mill, where two guards stood at the entrance, laughing loudly over mugs of ale. He waited patiently in the shadows until one of the men turned his back. In a flash, Gregory was behind them. The first guard barely had time to choke before Gregory's blade silenced him. The second staggered back, reaching for his sword, but Gregory caught him by the wrist, twisting hard until bone cracked. The man's scream was short-lived as Gregory's dagger found his throat. He slipped inside the mill, moving through the shadows like a ghost. The Iron Fangs were scattered, half-drunk and careless. Gregory struck with ruthless precision. One man fell with a crushed windpipe, another slumped face-first into his ale with a dagger buried in his back. Gregory moved room to room, eliminating them one by one, until only Vexen remained. Gregory found him in the mill's upper room, sitting at a table littered with maps and coins. Vexen's face darkened when he saw Gregory step from the shadows, crimson hood pulled low over his face. He reached for his club, but Gregory's blade was already at his throat. "You should have left me alone," Gregory said quietly. Vexen's lips curled into a snarl. You're no merchant. He spat. You're a killer. Gregory pressed the blade harder against his neck. I didn't want this, he growled. I gave you a chance to walk away. And what now? Vexen sneered. You going to kill me like the others? Gregory hesitated. Memories of his old life surged back, the bodies, the blood, the fear he had once inspired. He knew what would happen if he crossed that line again. Violence had a way of pulling you in, wrapping itself around you until you couldn't breathe. Gregory knew if he killed Vexen now, he would become that man again, the Crimson Ghost, a killer with no home and no peace. I'm not that man anymore, Gregory muttered, lowering his blade. Vexen's eyes widened in disbelief. You're sparing me? I'm giving you one last chance, Gregory said. Leave Elderglen. Never come back. Vexen's face twisted with fury. You think this is over? He spat. You think I'll just walk away? I'm not giving you a choice, Gregory said coldly. You'll leave, or next time, I won't stop. Vexen glared at him for a long moment, then spat on the floor. You've made a mistake, he growled. I'll find you again. And when I do... You won't, Gregory interrupted. Because if you come near this town again... He paused, his voice dropping to a low whisper. I will end you. He stepped back, sheathing his dagger, and turned away. Vexen stood frozen, watching as Gregory disappeared back into the shadows. For a long moment, the Iron Fang leader simply stood there, hand trembling over the hilt of his blade. Then he turned and fled into the night. Gregory returned to Elderglen before dawn. He knew the townsfolk would have questions he couldn't answer. His spy's shop was gone, and with it, the quiet life he had worked so hard to build. Yet for the first time in years, Gregory felt something unexpected, relief. The weight he had carried for so long, the burden of denying who he once was, had lifted. The Crimson Ghost was a name he had tried to bury, but now he understood that some things could never stay buried. Gregory knew that violence might find him again, that the world would never let him walk away entirely. But for now, Elderglen was safe, and that was enough. As the morning sun climbed over the horizon, Gregory sat alone on the steps of his ruined shop. His fingers played idly with the crimson hood he had worn the night before. He had won this battle, but war had a way of finding men like him. Gregory knew he couldn't outrun it forever. He rose to his feet and tucked the hood back into his pocket. He still had a town to protect, and whatever peace he could find, he intended to hold onto it for as long as he could. For now, that would have to be enough. Gregory Thorne stood at the edge of what used to be his spy's shop. The scent of charred wood still lingered in the air, clinging stubbornly to the walls that hadn't completely collapsed. The townspeople had done what they could to help him clear the wreckage, but most of what had been his livelihood was reduced to ash. Bits of broken jars still crunched beneath his boots, remnants of the colorful spices he had once proudly displayed. Cinnamon, saffron, and star anise, now just faint hints in the smoke-tainted air. It should have hurt more, losing everything he'd built, but Gregory found that he felt strangely calm. After everything, he was still standing. The Iron Fangs were gone, Vexen had fled, and for the first time in weeks, Elderglen felt safe again. The townspeople had already begun whispering about what had happened. The rumors spread quickly. Some claimed Gregory had paid assassins to kill the Iron Fangs, while others believed he had made some dark pact with the Crimson Ghost himself. No one knew the truth, and Gregory didn't plan to explain. The truth, that the Crimson Ghost and Gregory Thorne were one and the same, was something Elderglen didn't need to know. The fewer people who remembered the man he used to be, the better. Days passed, and Gregory kept to himself. He spent his mornings in the market square, helping others with odd jobs and errands. He spent his afternoons gathering lumber and brick from nearby villages, preparing to rebuild what he had lost. The people of Elderglen offered to help, but Gregory declined most of their offers. He didn't want gratitude, didn't want anyone feeling they owed him anything. He just wanted to be left alone. One evening, as Gregory sat outside the skeleton of his ruined shop, Marcus approached him with a bottle of wine tucked under his arm. Marcus didn't say much at first. He just uncorked the bottle and handed Gregory a cup. They drank in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the night. "You did the right thing," Marcus finally said. Gregory didn't answer. He wasn't sure if sparing Vexen had been the right thing. He had told himself that killing Vexen would mean losing control, slipping back into the violence that had once consumed him. But sparing Vexen, letting him walk away with that vengeful glare in his eyes, that felt like an unfinished chapter, a wound left open to fester. "You know he'll come back," Gregory muttered. Marcus took a slow sip of wine before replying. "Maybe. Or maybe he's smart enough to know what'll happen if he tries." Gregory shook his head. "Men like Vexen don't stop. Sooner or later, he'll find more men, rebuild his gang, and come back for blood." Marcus leaned forward, voice low. "Then you'll be ready." Gregory didn't reply. He wasn't sure he wanted to be ready. The longer he stayed in Elderglen, the harder it became to ignore the memories of his past. The people of the town still looked at him like he was just Gregory Thorne, the spice merchant, but some had begun to wonder. He caught the wary glances from time to time, the quiet whispers that followed him down the street. They knew he wasn't just a merchant anymore, they knew he had been something more. The next week, Gregory worked day and night to rebuild his shop. He told himself that keeping busy would help quiet his mind, but it didn't. The nights were the worst. When he closed his eyes, he kept seeing flashes of his old life, battlefields littered with bodies, blood dripping from his blades, the way his enemies had whispered the name Crimson Ghost like it was some terrible curse. Each morning, he woke to the same cold sweat, his heart racing as if he'd been running for hours. It wasn't long before another visitor found him, not Marcus this time, but a stranger. The man was well-dressed, clad in fine leather and polished boots that looked like they had never seen dirt. His face was thin and sharp, his dark eyes calculating. He introduced himself as Roderick Stain, an emissary from the kingdom to the north. "We've heard of your accomplishments," Roderick said smoothly. "Word travels fast. It's rare to hear about a man taking down an entire mercenary band on his own." "I didn't do it on my own," Gregory replied evenly. Roderick ignored the remark. "The kingdom is preparing for conflict," he continued. "We're gathering the best men we can find. Experienced men. Men with reputations. I'm not interested," Gregory said before the man could finish. "You haven't even heard the offer," Roderick pressed. "Gold. Property. Security. I have all the security I need," Gregory said. "You think that peace will last?" Roderick asked with a faint smile. "Men like you don't get peace, Gregory. You should know that by now." Gregory's fingers twitched toward his belt where his dagger was hidden. He forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not that man anymore." "Maybe not," Roderick said, rising from his chair. "But when war comes, and it will, you won't be able to sit this one out." Roderick left without another word, but Gregory knew this wasn't the last time they would meet. He had spent years convincing himself that the Crimson Ghost was gone, that the man he used to be had died the day he left behind his blades. But now, with Vexen out there nursing his hatred and men like Roderick sniffing around for soldiers, Gregory knew that peace was something he would always have to fight for. The next evening, Gregory sat quietly outside what remained of his spice shop. The wooden frame had been rebuilt, but there was still much to do. As he sat there, a figure crept through the shadows, a small boy, no older than 10. Gregory watched as the boy slipped into what was left of his shop and tried to pocket a loaf of bread. "You're not very good at that," Gregory called out. The boy froze, wide-eyed and pale. "Put it back," Gregory said quietly. "And come here." The boy hesitated but eventually shuffled over. He was thin, his clothes ragged and filthy. His face had the hollow look of someone who had spent too long wondering where their next meal would come from. Gregory knelt in front of him and placed the loaf of bread back in the boy's hands. "Take it," he said. "But next time you're hungry, you ask." The boy stared at him in disbelief before clutching the bread tightly and running off into the night. Gregory watched him disappear into the shadows. He had once believed that the Crimson Ghost was something dark, a violent force that could never be anything but destruction. But maybe there was another side to it. Maybe being dangerous didn't mean being cruel. Maybe the strength that had once defined him could be used to protect rather than destroy. As Gregory sat there, watching the stars scatter across the night sky, he knew his past would always follow him. Vexen would return one day. Roderick would come calling again. War and bloodshed would always find their way back to his doorstep. But for now, the town was safe. For now, the boy with the stolen bread had something to eat. For now, Gregory Thorne could breathe. And for now, that was enough. The morning air was crisp and cool as Gregory Thorne walked down the narrow streets of Elderglen. The town was waking up slowly, with merchants setting up their stalls and children running barefoot through the dusty roads. Gregory moved quietly, his steps light, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. Even after everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The calm felt fragile, like thin ice stretched too far. He knew better than to trust peace. His shop stood partially rebuilt now, the wooden frame solid but still missing a roof and much of the interior. Gregory spent most of his days rebuilding alone, piecing things together with steady, determined hands. The work kept his mind occupied, kept him from thinking too much about Vexen Grudge or the emissary Roderick Stain. He told himself he was just another merchant again, but deep down he knew that was a lie. The world wasn't done with him yet. Late that afternoon, Marcus arrived, carrying a satchel of nails and a battered hammer slung over his shoulder. Gregory hadn't asked for help, but Marcus had never been good at taking no for an answer. Without a word, Marcus set down the supplies and started hammering wooden planks into place. Gregory joined him, and for a while, neither spoke. The rhythm of hammer strikes and creaking wood filled the silence between them. "I heard some news," Marcus said finally, his voice low. Gregory kept hammering. "Good or bad?" "Bad," Marcus muttered. "Vexen's back." Gregory paused, resting his hammer against the wall. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel heavier. "How many men?" Gregory asked quietly. "Not as many as before," Marcus said. "Word is he's picked up whatever thugs were willing to follow him. He's angry, Greg. Real angry. I heard he's been telling people he's going to burn Elderglen to the ground." Gregory clenched his fists. He had hoped Vexen's retreat had been permanent, that the mercenary had learned his lesson. Clearly, Vexen's pride wouldn't allow that. "He won't stop," Gregory muttered. "Not until someone ends him." "I know," Marcus said. "And you know that someone has to be you." Gregory didn't answer. He walked away from the half-built wall and sat on the steps of his shop. He had been here before, standing at the edge of violence, knowing that blood would soon follow. He had spent years convincing himself that the Crimson Ghost was gone, buried with the life he had left behind. But now that life was clawing its way back to the surface. That evening, Gregory sat alone in the back of his shop, sharpening his dagger by candlelight. The blade had dulled slightly since the night he faced Vexen's men in the alley, but the steel was still strong. Each pass of the whetstone brought back memories, faces of men he had fought, soldiers who had begged for their lives before Gregory's blade silenced them. He hated those memories. Hated that they felt so familiar. A knock at the door startled him. Gregory tucked the dagger away and opened the door to find the boy who had tried to steal from him days earlier. The boy stood clutching a torn piece of parchment. "They said to give this to you," the boy said, thrusting the paper forward. His eyes were wide with fear. Gregory unfolded the parchment. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "Midnight. The North Road. Come alone." Gregory stared at the message for a long time. Vexen wasn't just planning an attack, he wanted Gregory to come to him directly. It wasn't hard to guess why. Vexen didn't just want revenge, he wanted to humiliate Gregory, to kill him in front of whatever men still followed him. Gregory knew he couldn't walk away from this. If he ignored the challenge, Vexen would burn Elderglen to the ground just to make his point. Gregory had seen men like Vexen before, violent men who couldn't stand the taste of defeat. If Gregory didn't end this now, more innocent people would suffer. That night, Gregory walked alone toward the north road, his crimson hood folded tightly in his pocket. The moon hung low in the sky, casting faint silver light over the trees that lined the narrow path. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. Gregory knew Vexen's men were close. He reached the clearing where Vexen was waiting. The mercenary stood near a fire, his face twisted into a cruel smile. Half a dozen men flanked him, each one armed to the teeth. Vexen stepped forward, his broad shoulders casting a dark shadow across the flickering flames. "I knew you'd come," Vexen said, his voice thick with triumph. "You couldn't resist, could you? You should have stayed gone," Gregory replied quietly. His hand hovered near the dagger at his belt. "You think you're still the man you used to be?" Vexen sneered. "You're not. You're soft now. Weak. Just a merchant playing soldier." Gregory said nothing. His fingers found the hilt of his dagger, his heart beat steady and calm. He had been here before, outnumbered, cornered, standing at the edge of death. But this time, he didn't feel fear. He felt cold. Focused. Vexen drew his club, the same weapon that had nearly crushed Gregory's ribs weeks earlier. He twirled it lazily in his hands. "This time," Vexen said, "I'm not leaving you alive." The first attacker lunged from Gregory's left, a blade flashing in the moonlight. Gregory sidestepped and drove his dagger into the man's side. The second attacker rushed forward, and Gregory caught him with a swift strike to the throat. The man dropped instantly. Vexen's face twisted in fury. He roared and charged, swinging his club with bone-crushing force. Gregory ducked low, spinning behind Vexen before driving his dagger across the back of the mercenary's leg. Vexen staggered, howling in pain. "You should have run," Gregory said coldly. Vexen twisted and swung again. This time Gregory blocked the strike with his arm, feeling the impact jar his bones. Pain flared up his side, but Gregory didn't stop. He pivoted, driving his elbow into Vexen's ribs, then grabbed the mercenary by the collar and slammed him face first into the ground. Vexen groaned, blood trickling from his mouth. "Finish it," he snarled. "Do it." Gregory stood over him, dagger poised. For a moment, he considered it, ending this once and for all. But the image of that boy with the stolen bread flashed through his mind. He remembered the look in the boy's eyes, fear, desperation, and just a hint of hope. Gregory lowered his dagger. "You're not worth the blood on my hands," he said. "You're a fool," Vexen spat. "Maybe," Gregory muttered. "But you're done." He turned and walked away, leaving Vexen bleeding in the dirt. As he disappeared into the shadows, Gregory knew this wasn't over. There would always be more men like Vexen, violent men who thrived on fear. Gregory had spent years running from his past, hoping he could bury the Crimson Ghost. But now he understood that he couldn't run anymore. The Crimson Ghost was a part of him, not just a weapon, but a guardian. A force that could be wielded not for destruction, but for protection. Gregory knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. For now, that was enough.